Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 6th floor museum at Dealey Plaza. My name is Stephen Fagin, and I'm the curator here at the museum. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Mexia High School here to the 7th floor for our Living History presentation. Living History is an educational program series that we do here at the museum where we invite someone who lived the experience of the 1960s to come and share their personal story with us. We'll be showing some pictures on the screens here and engaging in a conversation for about half an hour. And then you guys will have the chance to ask questions of our guest speaker to get a little bit more information. Our guest today is a longtime friend of this museum, Mr. Bruce Johnson, and Bruce actually marched in the funeral procession for President Kennedy on that National Day of Mourning, Monday, November 25th, 1963. So he's got a fascinating story to share with us today. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Johnson to speak with us. Bruce, let's start by taking a look at you back in the early 1960s. I'm going to circle you in this picture. There you are. This was about 1961?
Yes, 61.
Okay, and this was a wedding this photograph is from, right?
Yes, the fellow in the middle was getting married. His name is Jerry Hoganson. He joined the Foreign Service, the United States Foreign Service. He and I graduated from high school together. He's still living, as I am, even though we're up there in a few years. He's retired, as am I. But that's how I looked at the time. Whoops.
That's
okay. I didn't silence mine. I'm waiting for mine to go off. And the fellow on the left is named Kenny Brandt. He also graduated from high school with the other two up there. And that was an event in Oak Lawn, Illinois. I saw a fellow from Illinois here. At least he's wearing an Illinois shirt. I don't know where he's from, but anyway. That happened in Chicago, where I was working at the time.
Let's go back a year before this picture was taken to 1960. Now, in 1960, you had to be 21 years old to vote in an election. And 1960, which was Senator John F. Kennedy, the Democratic candidate, versus Republican candidate Vice President Richard Nixon, this was your first election.
Yes.
And
it was.
So who did you favor in that 1960 election?
Well, I favored Richard Nixon. And it's a sad story looking back because I benefited greatly from programs that John Kennedy brought to bear once he got into office as president. I was raised in the back room of a grocery store, and I carried forth basically an idea that my dad had, which was, as far as politics are concerned, he wanted to see both parties in a strong position because that way they couldn't get much done. And he figured the less government did, he was better off. He liked that was his attitude. And he would have liked Nixon simply because he was more of a business orientation. And as probably most of you, you're greatly influenced by two groups of adults, your parents and your teachers. That's about it. Some of your other relatives, possibly. So that was basically the influence I had. I did watch the debate, if any of you have seen that, between Nixon and Kennedy. And I started to have doubts. I thought, this guy Nixon, he looks terrible. But he's more experienced. You know, he'd already been vice president. I had been to the Republican convention in Chicago at the time when General Eisenhower, now keep in mind, I was 10 years old. Now you can do the math on this. I was 10 years old when World War II ended. So I know who General Eisenhower was, and he was giving a speech there. I happened to, somebody that worked with me got me in there to that convention, and Nixon was there. I just went with the experience. That's what I did. Looking back, I should have gone with the youth, because I think one of the things I learned, much to my regret later, do you hear that? That was my phone. I mean, somebody sent me a text, and I should have shut that thing off. Anyway, I spent too much time worrying about experience, what little thought I put into the election, and I should have thought about the youthful ideas that were needed in Washington. So that's the story of how I voted against John Kennedy, but much to my surprise later benefited greatly by programs that he put in that favored bringing youngsters into government.
You talked a little bit about Kennedy lacking that experience that Nixon had, and one of the things that was also against him in that election was his youth, the idea that he was too young to hold the office of president.
Definitely.
It's worth noting that Dwight Eisenhower at that time was the oldest president in American history up to that time, and Kennedy became, in 1960, the youngest man ever elected president, so there was this historic transition. In 61. Did that mean something to you, that for the first time a president actually born in the 1900s was in the White House?
I didn't think about that, but I did notice that Eisenhower was bald, and I had hair. Of course, I've still got the hair, but now I'm one of the old guys myself. That's terrible. But I did think that Kennedy was too young. I didn't put much thought into it, honestly. I really didn't. But I just thought that Nixon had more experience. He was vice president. Mm-hmm. So he's ready to be promoted to president. That was kind of the thought I had. But not a whole lot more thought than that.
Here in the early 60s, we're at the height of the Cold War. You joined the U.S. Army Reserves. And I want to put a map on the screen here showing the range of ballistic missiles. This is around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Set the scene for us. You're serving in the Army Reserves at this time. How did you feel about this impending threat of nuclear war with the Soviet Union?
Well, I had wanted to be, sorry, that was me again. I had wanted to be in the Air Force. In fact, when I was in college, I was in Air Force ROTC, but they wouldn't take me as a pilot, which I wanted to be because of my eyes. So I ended up, at the time, you're not familiar with this probably, at the time, every man, 18 and older, was registered with a selective service. Now you register, but at the time, you're going to be drafted. You would be drafted into the military, most likely the Army. Well, I didn't have anything against the Army. I just wanted to be a fighter pilot. It was just kind of my thing, you know. I never ended up doing that, so I ended up joining the Army Reserve because somebody I worked with said, well, they turned you down. Why don't you join the Army Reserve? And I said, what's that? I didn't know anything about it, so I joined. Little did I know that in a couple of years, while I had already been through basic training, and then all this problem started happening in Cuba, and Russia putting missiles in there. My thought was, well, I'll make them sorry now. They should have made me a pilot. I'd go shoot them down. That was my attitude. But I was really concerned that we were going to war with Russia. The missiles were there. As that chart shows, they could reach far into the United States, even into Canada. And this was a very perilous thing. I paid a great deal of attention to what President Kennedy was doing about it. And I was surprised to see and glad to see that when he faced down directly with Khrushchev, the Russian premier, that basically he got him to turn those ships around and go back. Because what Kennedy had done is imposed a embargo and saying to Russia, if you send any of your more ships towards Cuba, we're going to either turn them around or we're going to shoot them and we're going to sink them. It was pretty belligerent for a young president to do this. And as it turned out, I didn't get called up, but numerous times I got phony alerts that I was going to be mobilized to be sent down there. It didn't happen, but that's as close as I ever came to any kind of combat. I never left Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. I sat there running a typewriter most of the time. So that was my Army experience. I've got sons now who are retired who've been in multiple combat tours in the Middle East. So I saw none of that, really. But I knew how to shoot a weapon. I knew how to march and so forth.
Prior to this, when you were still in school, you participated in the duck and cover drills
Yes.
In case of nuclear war. To explain what you'd have to do as a student in those days if there was a nuclear war. What would happen?
I grew up in a town, Superior, Wisconsin, which is right at if you can visualize a map of the United States, the Great Lakes are up there in the middle near Canada, bordering Canada. My hometown is right at the westernmost tip of Lake Superior, and the name of it is Superior, Wisconsin. That's about 120 miles south of the Canadian border. And right now, it's about 15 or 20 degrees below zero there. So if you think it's cool here, it's 40 degrees cooler there right now. So notice a number of you got hats on and hoods up. It's cold there. That's what I grew up with. But at any rate, the Russian bombers would, if they attacked us, would come over the top of the globe, of the earth, and would come in through Canada. So my hometown had radar installations around there to detect incoming Russian bombers. We didn't worry about missiles then. We didn't have them. Not the kind of missiles that could reach us from Russia. But duck and cover meant there would be not fire alarms, there would be attack alarms, and we would, believe it or not, we'd dive under his desk. Now, what good would that do, you know? But that's what we did.
You would literally just get under your desk,
We
put your
would
hands over your head,
yes.
and hope that you would be spared from the nuclear holocaust.
And
by
hope
then.
my desk would protect me, which of course was ridiculous.
Do you think in retrospect that was done more for peace of mind among the students than anything else?
Probably because, in fact, the people that set it up knew perfectly well that it might, you know, for example, a tornado, which you're all familiar with what you do there, it would make more sense to climb in the bathtub and at home, climb in the bathtub and cover it up with mattresses or something to protect you from falling parts from your own house. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't obviously that wasn't an option. So duck under your desk. If the teacher wasn't under their desk, the teachers are over here, right? They would get under their desk, and the students would get under their desk. Well, if you had a chair like this, how much protection was that? Yeah. Not much. But I think it was right. You're right. It was an educational process to be alert. Mm-hmm. It could happen. But we really had no defense from incoming bombs.
So while you were serving in the Army Reserves, President Kennedy was your commander-in-chief. Yes. And even though you didn't vote for him in 1960, I think you suggested a moment ago, your opinion of him changed a little bit after he became president.
It did. Because by then I had gotten a job. My dad just about had a heart attack. He ran a grocery store, small grocery store. My first job was in Chicago, and I got a job with the Internal Revenue Service, who collects the taxes. Well, he didn't have a lot of love for those people. My answer to him was, but Dad, it's a job. I mean, I had paid for my own college education at the University of Wisconsin by working on a railroad up in northern Wisconsin in the wintertime, in the night. That's when young guys, where and when they worked. So my dad didn't have much use for the IRS, but there I was. But one of the things I discovered shortly after that, I got a job with the Internal Revenue Service in Kansas City. And while I was there, I was assigned to an Army Reserve unit, and I would go to meetings and so forth, go to summer camp and all the rest. I benefited from one of JFK's earliest programs, which was to bring youngsters into the government in Washington. It was a bunch of old guys. Of course, now look at me here. I'm one of them. I'm one of the old guys. But the government was paralyzed by too many oldsters. There wasn't enough young blood, and he was the youngest. He was the first president, you told me?
First president born in the 20th century.
In the 20th century. So he was a real youngster, and he brought in young ideas. And I benefited greatly from a program that they created throughout the federal government, which is to identify people that had potential that were young and bring them to Washington and help them bring in new ideas. And I benefited from that directly. And here's a guy, I didn't even vote for him. And I started benefiting really within a couple of years of his term.
The picture you're seeing there is the Washington, D.C. of 1962, and there's an Army, appropriately enough, there's an Army helicopter flying across the screen there. It's worth noting that President Kennedy, despite being in office for a very short time, he really did change the trajectory of your life because you ended up being with the IRS until the 1990s. Is that correct?
Yes. Would you believe this? I retired 25 years ago.
But it's worth noting you were...
I retired when your teachers weren't even teaching yet, probably.
The administrations of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and Bill Clinton. You were with the IRS during the presidencies of all of those individuals.
Yes, yeah.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, my office was just about 3 or 4 blocks. The address of his office was 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Mine was 1111 Constitution Avenue. The IRS building is right next to the Justice Department. And it was just 4 long blocks over there. And I was in the White House a lot. It doesn't operate that way now, but you could just walk over there and get in line and take a tour.
You got to see President Kennedy in person a couple of times. Tell us about that.
Well, they would have these luncheons whenever an ambassador, or not so much an ambassador, but the elected head of any government, any country's government, visited Washington. They would have, on nice days, pleasant days, they would have what they call a rose garden ceremony. And they would need warm bodies, and I was a voluntary warm body to sit in the audience. They needed people to be in the audience when they would have the visiting, say, Theresa May, who's now the Prime Minister in England, was visiting. She would give a speech, and then if she had been there when Kennedy was president, he would have given a little speech, and then they'd have lunch and all that. And we would just be people sitting in the audience like you are here. So that was a way, this was just a way every government agency had a list of people who were willing to go down, and I was just one of those who did. I thought it was a big deal to go there.
As the only person in this room who actually saw Kennedy in person, give us a sense, did he look the same as he looks on those magazine covers out there?
Yeah, he does. He did, yes. He looked just like that. Yeah. So did his wife. She looked the same. There's no doubt. They looked the same. So I think those are accurate pictures.
Yeah. Take us back to November 22nd, 1963. Where were you that day?
I was at work, and in fact, the way I found out about the president's assassination was I was at lunch with some other guys, my own age, young guys, not much older than all of you. Yeah. By the way, I meant to ask this question. How many high school seniors are in the room? Seniors. Juniors.
Okay.
Juniors.
All juniors.
Aha. Well, you're about to enter the on-ramp to the superhighway of life. Because in 4 months, 3 months really, those seniors are gone, right? What are you going to be on June 15th? You're going to be seniors, right? You will be. They're gone, so you must be seniors. So is everybody here a junior? All juniors. Okay, well, great.
That's exciting.
Yeah, the reason I say this, how many of you are driving, have a driver's license? A lot. Yeah, okay. A lot, more than half probably. So the reason I say you're about to enter the superhighway to life, have you noticed, how many of you, that first time you pulled onto I-35, and they're going 75, and you're looking down the speedometer and you're going maybe 45, you've got to gun it up to get up to their speed, right? You remember the first time you did? Yeah, well, you know, they're going fast. Guess what? The senior grade is going faster than you are right now. So you've got to ramp it up. So
We should point out you've done some teaching since your retirement, so you're very at home in a
I'm a sub. I'm the one that comes in when your
setting.
teacher's not there for whatever reason, yeah. But I get a big kick out of it. You're my fountain of youth.
Well, take us back to lunch on November 22nd.
Lunch, November 22nd. Out to lunch with some guys, my own age. Guys, by the way, there's another thing. There weren't many women there. There really weren't.
Working in the government in those days?
No, there wasn't. There really wasn't. Bad attitude by those old guys. So who knows what kind of bad attitude I've got right now. I won't know it. The ones that were making those decisions, they didn't know they were not good decisions. But anyway, we're walking back to the office, just probably 3 or 4 blocks from whatever restaurant we're at. We saw all these people standing on Constitution Avenue. They're all over the place, way more people than usual. And here was an old guy, quote, old guy, that was one of my mentors at my job there in Washington, was out there with some other folks, and I recognized him. I walked up and I said, Mr. Grimes, what's going on? Why are all these people out here? We thought there was an accident, but there was no crash there. He said, didn't you know? The president was killed. President Kennedy was assassinated. You know what the first thought that came into my mind was? The old guys are going to take over the government again. That's exactly what I thought. I really did. Other than the concern, oh my gosh, how did he get killed? You know, and then he said somebody shot him down in Dallas. I guess I was vaguely aware maybe that he was out of town. I didn't know that. Little did I know I would end up in Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
So,
But the idea of it, that was the first thought that came into your mind because Kennedy represented something youthful
Youth.
and, yeah.
Youth.
Huh.
He was my guy by then, for sure. Then many years later, I benefited from another one of his programs. But aside from that, my first thought was, wow, somebody killed the president, and then secondly, wow, the old guys are going to come back and take over the government. That was not a good thought. In my mind, that was not a good thing.
Now, how soon after the assassination did you find out that you were going to be part of the president's funeral?
I think that night. I got a call from my reserve company commander and said, "Do you have a clean uniform?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Do you have shiny boots?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, shine them again. You're marching in the president's funeral cortege." And I said, "I am?" And he said, "I'm telling you, you are. That's an order.
Wow.
And be at the armory tomorrow. We're going to practice." So I did.
Let's take a look at what you had to do that day, and then I want to hear a little bit about the practice and the prep you did.
Yeah.
So the map that's up there on either side here on the screen, it shows the Capitol, the White House. So starting on Monday morning, starting with the Capitol, the procession went with the president's body, which had been lying in state at the Capitol Rotunda.
Yes.
You went from there to the White House.
Yes.
And there, Mrs. Kennedy and a number of dignitaries joined on foot in a 1-mile procession from the White House to St. Matthew's Cathedral there, higher up on the map. So that was about 1 mile there. And then after the Mass at the cathedral, then it was about 3 miles that you marched from St. Matthew's all the way there across the Potomac to Arlington National Cemetery. So you were estimating earlier that you marched about 5-6 miles at least that day.
Yeah, I didn't think about it.
Were you in training enough that was not an experience that would have affected you at that time?
Yeah, I didn't think about it. The thing I thought about was how quiet it was. And as we marched, well, a couple of things. It's a slow cadence in a funeral procession. When you see, are they going to see a little movie of this?
Yeah, we're going to do it. But take us back first to the training. You're told to shine your shoes and get ready. What prep did they give you for this experience that you were not anticipating?
Marching around, well, one of the things I hadn't thought about until I got there the first time is that you march with a weapon. At the time it was an M1 rifle. You might find them nowadays in a gun range, and it's regarded as an antique. But you carry it on your shoulder. But one of the things that we discussed was whether or not they were going to remove what they call the bolt from this. Are anybody here hunters at all? Anybody? So when you remove the bolt from a rifle, it can't be fired. Well, why would that come up? Well, the president had been killed by a Marine. Now, the Marines, I have a high school friend still living who is a Marine. There are no such things as ex-Marines. Anybody here have a relative of a Marine? They take great pride in once a Marine, always a Marine, right? You've heard that. This was a Marine that had assassinated the president. Now, granted, he wasn't on duty at the time, and he was out, as it turned out. He had some crazy ideas and all the rest, but he was trained how to shoot by the Army, or by the Marines, I mean. So, I was apprehensive about that, and obviously the commanders, everybody that was organizing this, they were debating. I cannot remember to this day whether or not I had the bolt in that rifle or not. I suspect I did not, because don't forget, the president was killed on a Friday, and then over the weekend at various times, all this crazy stuff happened here in Dallas, including more shootings. So they were very apprehensive about a funeral cortege, everybody carrying a rifle. They better make sure that none of those rifles can be fired. But I honestly don't remember, and I haven't found anybody who could tell me whether or not we marched with the bolts in or out. But that was a worrisome thing. And then other than that was practicing to march in the parking lot. And the cadence is slightly slower than ordinarily a military march. The pace is slower. It doesn't look like this, but it's kind of awkward when you do it.
We'll show a home movie of that, but this picture showing the caisson bearing the president's flag-draped casket, you were marching in front of the casket. The casket was,
yes.
was towards the end. And I looked up the order of the procession, and we determined that you were between the National Guard and the Marine Corps Reserves. There was a little unit of U.S. Army Reserves, and you were part of that. We'll actually see you. We won't be able to identify you in the crowd, but we'll be able to see your unit marching in just.
I could claim I was any one of them, and probably.
That's right. So there was a bystander named Joe O'Dwyer who was on top of the Mayflower Hotel on Connecticut Avenue, and he happened to be in a vantage point where he was able to capture the procession marching from the White House to St. Matthew's Cathedral and then back again. And so he actually recorded on his home movie camera a film of the procession both coming to and from the Mass. So let's take a look at this. There's a still photograph there showing Mrs. Kennedy and the President's two brothers, Bobby and Ted, marching in the procession, and then we'll jump to this home movie. So there they are. Anything that stands out, Bruce, you can narrate this for us, because, of course, home movies didn't have sound back in 1960.
Well, the white hats would have been Navy or Marines. Of course, President Kennedy was a naval veteran, so.
It was estimated that 1 million people were lining the route that day between the Capitol and Arlington National Cemetery, and, of course, several million more were watching live on television. The three networks, there were only three major networks in those days, they had a total of 50 cameras stationed along the route and at Arlington to capture the funeral procession and broadcast it live on television. Tell us about the sound again. You started to talk about that earlier, about how quiet it was.
Yeah, as we marched down, particularly going from the National Cathedral to the Arlington Cemetery, it was so quiet. Yet there were hundreds of thousands of people. It was a November day. It was kind of crisp, sunny day. I remember this very clearly. And you could see the steam from people's breath over to the side. But it was so quiet, and all you could hear was our feet going. All the boots.
That massive humanity there, those are foreign dignitaries, everybody from Charles de Gaulle from France, Haile Selassie from Ethiopia, and this is an extraordinary moment that all of these world leaders are marching unprotected down the middle of the street 2 days after the President of the United States has been shot and killed on a street.
We did a lot of talking among ourselves about we thought it was dangerous because the fact that sort of confirms my own mind. We must have marched without the bolts. These folks over here that hunt know what I'm talking about. You can't fire it. So there were many high-ranking people from other countries even. Plus, our whole government was there out in the open. So,
including the new president, Lyndon Johnson.
Including the new president, yeah. But the thing about it is that marching along, and this is a very wide street, Constitution Avenue is very wide. It leads ultimately to the Arlington Cemetery. It's very wide. It's probably 8 or 10 lanes wide. Marching in the middle of that, and over here you could see, you don't look your head, but your eyeballs move over there and look. And I could see people, just a sea of people out there, and it was just totally silent. You could see the breath going up in the sunlight. Every once in a while you hear a little kid would say, "Mommy, where's the horse?" or something like that. And you'd hear, "Shh." Yet they were probably 25 yards away from me, and I could hear, it was so quiet. The thing that got me was it was so quiet, very somber.
Did it go through your mind at that moment, and all that time you had to yourself not talking, that millions of people were watching on television as well as the folks that were lining the streets?
No, it didn't. I was more concerned with marching. You got to be careful. You have to pay attention to what you're doing. You get out of step, you're a real clown. I mean, you just don't do it. So I think I was more focused on that and my rifle, keeping it in the right position.
Here's a picture from just outside St. Matthew's Cathedral. Cardinal Cushing is there with the casket. While the Mass is taking place inside the cathedral, what are you doing outside?
Standing there.
At parade rest?
Probably standing at ease.
Okay.
Well, maybe a parade rest. I'm not sure.
Okay. So
probably at ease. That's a pretty long time to stand at parade rest.
Okay. So you just had to wait, no talking, nothing like that?
No talking, nothing. Stand there in formation. Don't talk, don't do anything.
For about an hour until the Mass was over.
Right.
Okay. And then you had another 3 miles ahead of you because while Mrs. Kennedy and all the dignitaries were going to get into limousines for the trip to Arlington. They weren't going to march that long way. You had to march the full 3 miles.
Right. It really, by that time, I was beginning to think this is an honor. And in fact, it was a very high honor. I never earned any honors in the military other than my sharpshooter badge. This is a very high honor, but it was unearned. I just happened to be a member of the Army Reserve unit that was designated to represent the entire Army Reserve system.
We're about to see your unit march by in just a moment. This is coming back from the cathedral. Is that your group right there?
It probably is.
I
I'm
believe
probably
so.
one of those guys.
Followed by the Marine Corps Reserve.
You can tell the Marines with the white hats.
So you were part of a very small company there marching in the parade. Do you remember how many there were from the Army Reserve?
Probably 40, maybe 40 or 50.
Okay. And there's the caisson, and then in a moment we're going to see Blackjack, the riderless horse. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about the significance of that with the stirrups, the boots reversed in the stirrups. What does that mean?
Well, it means that the leader is gone, is what it means. And it's a sobering thing to see, because we were behind that, or we were in front of that caisson, but I recall that we were not pushed, but we marched off to the side when they reached the National Cathedral. We saw the caisson come up there, and have them unload it from there and have the pallbearers carrying it in. It's a very sobering experience, but that horse signifies the loss of the leader.
So all these dignitaries that were marching to the cathedral, now we see them in the cars being flanked by security personnel there. And then you reach Arlington National Cemetery for the burial services. Now, where were you, compared to this photograph, which is showing the actual burial site, where were you stationed?
As we entered the cemetery, all the units ahead of the caisson went off to the left on a road there, and we were standing in formation there. So we could hear the artillery when they fired the 21-gun salute, but we couldn't hear any of the conversation.
Tell us about the flyover. What did you notice?
Oh, yeah, a lot of planes. I only found out later there was one for every state. I didn't know that. It just seemed like they never ended, followed by Air Force One. I did see that. It's very loud. They were very, very low and very, very loud. So there's one plane for each state, plus Air Force One.
Yeah. Now, looking back on this experience, we're here 55 years after you marched in President Kennedy's funeral. What does this mean to you? You mentioned it was a high honor, and you recognized that at the time, but over the passage of time, has this come to mean something more to you?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, it gave me a lot of more respect for weapons, because let's keep in mind, somebody went and got up in this building and killed a president using a weapon. I was raised in a little town where you got a BB gun when you're about 8 or 9 years old, and I got a .22 rifle when I was probably 13 or 14, and a friend and I would ride our bikes to the town dump and shoot rats, and nobody thought anything about it. But I think that's the first instance that I really thought about this serious problem of controlling weapons. How did this nut job get a weapon and kill a president with it and get away with it? And he physically got away from the premises. How did that happen? So I thought about that, but I also have been left with a realization that it's important, despite my age. I am now one of the old guys, but I do substitute teach periodically, partly just to keep in mind what young thinking is. It's given me more, I think it's left me with a greater appreciation to listen to what youngsters are saying, and maybe they ought to be listened to, more so than I would have otherwise. And it was a high honor, unearned. I just happened to be there. I was one of the guys that got a call saying, "You're marching."
We have one more picture to share with you, and it's a picture taken in some random home in anywhere America, and it's a little tiny black and white television. It looks like it's been propped up on a stepladder so several people can see, and you can see there's a bunch of chairs gathered around that tiny little TV. This is the way millions across the country experienced the Kennedy funeral live. You've probably encountered numerous people in your life who saw you marching on television that day, because anybody who had access to a television was probably watching the funeral that day. When people throughout your life have discovered that you marched in Kennedy's funeral, what kind of a reaction do they have to that?
You did? That's kind of the reaction. I never really thought about it much during the intervening many years. Actually, I came down to this museum looking for a possibility of finding a picture of myself in uniform. That's how I even found out about this museum.
That's how we met.
I knew it was here, but I didn't pay any attention, really. So over the years, I'd say it left me with a residual idea that got to pay attention to what youngsters are saying. They could be right. Not always. Don't get carried away here. I don't think you're always right. But I think I probably paid more attention than I might have otherwise.
We want to give you guys the chance to ask Mr. Johnson some questions. So if you'll raise your hand, I will get to as many of those as we can, and I'll repeat the questions since I have the microphone being recorded by the camera. What questions do you have for Bruce Johnson today about his experiences, the assassination, whatever you want to talk about?
Somebody ought to ask, can you prove you were there? The fact is, I can't find a copy of the written orders that told me to be there. Now, I haven't gotten around to doing what I could do, which is write to somebody and ask them to find it. But
And you don't still have your uniform, do you?
No, I kept my uniform for quite a while and gave it to one of my grandsons. I've got...
We got a question over here. Yes?
Yes.
As soon as he found out about the assassination? Okay, question was, as soon as you found out about the assassination, can you describe what went on in your head? What went through your mind?
Back to the old guys. That's exactly what I thought. I thought, number one, that wasn't number one. Number one was, how could this have happened? Because this fellow that I met said he'd been shot. Well, how could this be? How could this happen? I knew about the Secret Service. I even belonged to what we called a Toastmasters Club. It was part of the president's Secret Service detail. So I knew a lot about how they protect him. So I couldn't, number one, I was kind of shocked. I mean, I probably said something, really? Well, this fellow that I respected told me that's what happened. But then my next thought was, oh my gosh, and we talked about this, myself and some of the others, these old guys are going to take over again. That's exactly what we thought. And basically I was right. Little did I know that Lyndon Johnson, one of the old guys, would become president, and he did implement most of the programs that JFK actually originated. As it turns out, Lyndon Johnson had way more legislative experience, knew how to get laws passed than JFK did. But JFK had the ideas, and Lyndon Johnson implemented them. But my first thoughts were, how could this happen? And then here come the old guys. That was my reaction.
Yeah, go ahead.
How did your family react to the assassination?
How did your family react to the assassination?
Everybody was shocked. And of course, we're talking about the assassination itself and the funeral. But at the time, the headlines and the TV, we did have a little black and white TV at home. The headlines were all about all these things that were happening down in Dallas, like this guy Lee Harvey Oswald shooting a police officer, and then he himself being shot inside the jail and all the rest. It was just a lot of chaos, and everybody was just shocked. And of course, the people that I knew, everybody was either a veteran or was in the Army. So don't forget, this was still at a time when the military draft was still in effect. I was on active duty between the Korean War and the Vietnam War, so there wasn't much conflict happening in the world, except for Russia pushing on us a little bit. So it was just a shock. It was just a shock. Everything just sort of stopped. That's how my family reacted. Yes. Guy from Illinois.
What's wrong with the old guys taking over?
Well, I'm biased. I'd say old guys are good to take over. But I do think you need a mix. Now, keep in mind, I'm mostly joking, but not completely. The world is moving faster in the next grade you're going into, next senior. Go on to college. The biggest investment you can make in yourself is your own education. I'm sure your teachers would tell you the same thing, and they probably already have. But education will make you realize that you don't know everything. And there is a point in life where I spent a year, another program that I benefited from JFK was, by the time I was 35, I was given a year's fellowship at a university far away from where I was in Washington, and could reflect more, a year of graduate study with no requirements what I take. Began to realize, even at that time, by that time I was 35, that I didn't know everything. Obviously, what would I be doing in grad school if I knew everything? I don't. But I do think that there is a tendency when you reach my age to not pay enough attention to kids. And I think if I was not my wife taught for 25 years, really almost 30 years. You know, I finally got on board. I had a business after I retired and got real involved in that. But I do think that it was wise to move the voting age down from 21 to 18. I've gone back and forth over the years whether or not I agree with that. I still think, at this point, the voting age of 18. By the way, vote. Those of you, how many of you are 18? There might be a few in here. Yeah, okay. I had a room full of seniors. Everybody, I'd say, you know, we got an election coming up. Here's my short lecture. Vote.
Any other questions for Mr. Johnson? Yes. What are your thoughts on all the conspiracy theories related to the assassination?
I think that John Kennedy was killed by one person, and it was a nut job, and he did it on his own. I've read all of the material. I was fascinated by all of it, but I never really wavered from that. There's all kinds of things about the mound outside the building here and all the rest, and all these other people. However, I still think it was one nut job, and that is one of the reasons why I think even though my history would tell you that I'd probably be more inclined to say we don't need gun controls, over the years I've come to realize it's still easy for a nut job to get a hold of a weapon that does a lot of damage. And those are kind of the things that I think about.
What about you guys? How many of you think there was a conspiracy? Raise your hands. How many of you think Oswald did it by himself? Okay. Well, vast majority think Oswald acted alone. That's actually pretty rare. It's about, I think the last national survey found that upwards of 60% believed in a conspiracy over Oswald acting alone. So that's interesting that you guys believe Oswald did it by himself. Any last questions? Yeah, one more. Go ahead.
How was life during the Great Depression?
You'll have to ask my dad.
Hang on. The question was, how was life during the Great Depression, which was a little before your time.
That's a great one because we needed to laugh. Half you guys are going to sleep. Oh, he knows the answer.
Hang on. We got one more question here. Yes, sir, in the back.
Well, I just wanted to, I was a contemporary, a little younger than you, but not that much. I could not have voted for Kennedy because I was not yet a voting age.
Okay.
But I remember the magic that we called Camelot.
Yes.
And they brought that to the country. There was an excitement and there was a youth activity, as you already mentioned. But we called it Camelot. And I remember exactly where I was when I heard that the assassination had happened. I was a junior at Texas A&M. I was standing in front of England's bookstore. Somebody came out of the bookstore and said the president's been shot. Those kinds of things you don't forget where you were. That and 9/11 are two things that will always be
Well, as I said, I benefited greatly from his ideas, and I didn't vote for him. But I changed my mind.
So if Kennedy had lived, chances are good he would have run against Senator Barry Goldwater. So in that 1964 election, imagining a matchup between Goldwater and Kennedy, you would have voted for President Kennedy.
I would have, yes. Although politically, I probably didn't agree with him on a number of things, but I did think he represented something, as the gentleman mentioned, that was way overdue. But again, I was surrounded by older people and, felt kind of as an outsider in that situation. So I benefited from the very, very thought that you're mentioning.
We want to thank you guys for being here today, and I hope you'll join me in thanking Bruce Johnson for giving his time this morning to share his story with us.